The owner of a bankrupt hotel allowed a homeless man and his grandson to sleep in a room for one night. At dawn, he was paralyzed when he saw what the beggar was doing with his grandson. The rain was falling, as if the sky wanted to wash away all the filth of the world at once, hitting hard on the deserted sidewalks and forming puddles that reflected the weak lights of the lampposts. Richard held Michael against his chest under a narrow awning that barely protected them from the storm, feeling his grandson's small body tremble as water ran down both of their torn clothes. The 65-year-old man held the boy desperately, trying to transfer all the warmth his tired body could still produce, while Michael's fever burned through the soaked fabric. Richard's hands, calloused from 5 years of living on the streets, caressed the boy's wet hair, and he whispered promises he didn't know if he could keep, because lying to a sick child seemed the least of sins, when the alternative was to let him lose hope. The cold wind cut through their clothes like invisible blades, and Richard felt every bone in his body ache, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the tightness in his chest when he looked at Michael's feverish face. "It's going to get better, my boy, I promise it will get better," he whispered, feeling his own voice tremble. Michael raised his large dark eyes to his grandfather, those eyes that still held innocence despite everything they had seen, and Richard felt a deep pain of guilt tighten his chest. Fragmented images invaded Richard's mind, like lightning illuminating the darkness of night, and he suddenly saw himself standing before an immense mirror, wearing an impeccable Italian-cut suit, adjusting his silk tie before the grand opening of the Emperor Hotel. His hair was perfectly combed, his shaved face exuded expensive lotion, and beside him a beautiful woman smiled while holding his hand, that woman with clear eyes and a smile that seemed to hold all the secrets of the world. The scene changed abruptly, and Richard saw himself sitting behind a mahogany desk, signing papers that an elegant hand with red nails slid before him, one by one, while that voice, sweet as honey, spoke words he could no longer completely remember. Then came the image of his son, Michael's father, sitting in the dark room of the house that was no longer theirs, with his hands on his head, and the desperate eyes of someone who saw no way out. And Richard felt the same helplessness from then tighten his chest again. The rain of memory fell on two coffins side by side, while Richard held the small hand of a Michael only 4 years old, both dressed in borrowed clothes because they had nothing left, and the boy asked where Daddy and Grandma were. "They've gone to a better place, my son. A place where it doesn't rain," Richard had said that day, swallowing his own tears. Michael's weak voice brought him back to the present, and Richard blinked several times, trying to push away the memories that insisted on hurting him. Across the street, through the curtain of rain, the dim lights of the San Miguel Hotel blinked like a distant beacon, and Richard fixed his gaze on that 3-story building that had known better days. The walls needed paint, some windows had poorly disguised cracks, and the illuminated sign with the hotel's name had 2 letters burned out, but it was still infinitely better than the freezing awning where they were. Richard knew they couldn't stay there all night, not with Michael burning with fever and coughing in that way that made his chest seem to tear from within. He had sworn to protect this boy, the only good thing left of his shattered family, and he wouldn't fail now, not after having failed everyone else. The pride that once defined him as a man was buried somewhere along with his former life, but his love for his grandson still pulsed strongly as the only fuel that kept him alive. "Hold on a little longer, Michael, just a little longer," said Richard, pressing the boy against himself. The sound of a door opening cut through the sound of the rain, and Richard raised his tired eyes to see a man of approximately 38 years coming out of the side entrance of the San Miguel Hotel. Frank carried 2 garbage bags in his hands and wore a wrinkled dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, fabric pants that had once been good, and worn shoes that made small sounds as they stepped in puddles. His face had that look of someone carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, with deep circles marking the skin below his brown eyes and a permanent expression of worry etched between his eyebrows. His dark brown hair was disheveled, as if he had run his hands through it many times throughout the day, and his 2 or 3 day stubble gave him an even more tired appearance. Frank threw the bags into the trash container next to the hotel and was about to return when his gaze met Richard's from across the street, and he stopped completely, fixing his eyes on the old man and the child shivering under that miserable awning. For a long moment, Frank simply stood there in the rain that soaked his shoulders, and Richard could see the battle happening inside that man, the hesitation between moving forward or doing something that would probably complicate his life. Then Frank looked back at one of the second-floor windows of the hotel, and Richard followed his gaze until he saw a female silhouette watching from above. "Please," Richard whispered to himself. "Please, be a good man." Frank took a deep breath and began crossing the street toward them, and Richard felt his heart race with a mixture of hope and fear. When Frank got close to the awning, the rain running down his face as he looked from Richard to Michael, and there was something in that younger man's eyes that Richard immediately recognized because he had seen it in his own reflection many years ago. It was genuine compassion mixed with extreme weariness. Frank opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again as if he were fighting against all the voices of common sense in his head, and finally the words came out in a low but firm tone. "Come, I'll give you shelter for one night. My hotel is empty anyway," Frank said, and Richard felt tears mix with the rainwater on his face. The pride that remained in Richard screamed for him to refuse, not to accept charity, to maintain what little dignity he still possessed. But then Michael coughed violently against his chest, and pride was crushed by a father's desperation, or rather, a grandfather's. Richard nodded slowly, unable to speak because he knew if he opened his mouth only sobs would come out, and began to rise with difficulty, holding Michael in his trembling arms. Frank extended his hand to help him, and Richard accepted it, feeling the firmness of that palm against his, and it was as if for a second he became human again in someone's eyes. "Thank you," Richard managed to whisper, his voice hoarse from not speaking much for days. Frank just nodded and began guiding them across the wet street toward the hotel, and each step Richard took seemed to weigh a ton. The entrance of Hotel San Miguel had a small faded red canopy that finally sheltered them from the merciless rain, and Richard took a deep breath, feeling momentary relief as Frank opened the glass door with a push. The lobby that revealed itself before them had once been elegant. That was obvious from the dark wood details on the walls and the crystal chandelier hanging from the ceiling, but now everything had that air of past glory, with the carpet worn in some spots and cracked leather armchairs in the corners. There was a reception desk on the left made of marble with golden veins, behind it several shelves with numbered keys hanging on hooks, and a wide staircase at the back leading to the upper floors. The smell inside the lobby was of mold mixed with some kind of cheap floral cleaning product, and only 2 of the wall sconces were lit, casting long shadows that made the environment simultaneously cozy and melancholic. Richard held Michael closer as Frank led them inside, and that was when he heard the sound of high heels descending the stairs with measured and deliberate steps. "Frank, I need to talk to you," said a female voice that had that artificial quality of sweetness that Richard immediately distrusted. The woman who came down the stairs looked as if she had stepped out of a fashion magazine, completely out of place in that decaying hotel and in that situation. Valerie was approximately 35 and wore a tight navy blue dress that accentuated every curve of her slender body, heels that made her legs seem endless, and perfectly brushed blonde hair that fell in studied waves over her shoulders. Her face was of a calculated beauty, with high cheekbones, full lips painted dark red, and blue eyes that shone with a coldness that dramatically contrasted with the smile she forced upon reaching the lobby. Discreet but clearly expensive jewelry adorned her neck and wrists, and the impeccable red nails lightly tapped on the designer handbag she carried. When Valerie's eyes landed on Richard and Michael, her entire face contracted in an expression of barely disguised disgust, as if she had just smelled something bad, and she looked from one to the other before fixing her gaze on Frank with a clear question. Richard watched her carefully as she descended the last steps, and something about her deeply troubled him, a strange feeling of déjà vu that he couldn't fully identify. Valerie approached Frank, completely ignoring Richard and Michael, as if they were part of the decoration or stains on the wall that she preferred not to see. "Frank, darling, I need to speak with you privately," she said, placing a hand with perfect nails on his arm. Frank took a deep breath, and Richard saw the man's jaw tighten before he responded. "Valerie, these are Richard and Michael. They'll be staying with us for one night because they need shelter," said Frank, keeping his tone calm but firm. Valerie blinked several times as if she couldn't process what she was hearing, then let out a short laugh, that contained no true humor, only barely contained incredulity and irritation. She turned completely toward Frank, deliberately rudely turning her back on Richard and his grandson, and when she spoke again, her voice had that sharp quality of someone trying to maintain composure in public. "Frank, can we talk in the office, please?" said Valerie through clenched teeth disguised by a smile. Frank looked at Richard and Michael, then at Valerie, and Richard saw the internal conflict of that good man fighting against the pressure of the woman who clearly had some kind of influence over him. "They need help, Valerie. I'll get them settled first and then we'll talk," Frank responded, and there was a new determination in his voice that surprised even himself. Valerie stepped back as if she'd been slapped, her blue eyes widening for a fraction of a second before narrowing dangerously. "You can't bring vagrants here, Frank. What if they steal something? What if they frighten the few guests we still have?" said Valerie, slightly raising her voice. Richard felt the words hit his chest like stones, but he swallowed the humiliation and kept his head down. Frank, for the first time since they had entered the lobby, completely straightened his shoulders and looked directly into Valerie's eyes, with a firmness that Richard didn't expect from someone so visibly exhausted. "It's one night and an empty room, Valerie. I have compassion," Frank said, and each word came out clear and definitive. The silence that followed was dense and uncomfortable, with Valerie staring at Frank as if she were seeing a stranger, and Frank maintaining his steady gaze, despite Richard noticing his hands trembling slightly at his sides. Valerie opened her mouth to respond, closed it, took a deep breath through her nose, making her nostrils flare, and then slowly turned to Richard and Michael with a smile that was anything but friendly. "Well, since my fiancé has decided to be charitable today, welcome to the Hotel San Miguel," she said, with a sweetness so fake that even Michael, in his feverish state, shrank against Richard. Her blue eyes traveled over Richard from top to bottom, lingering on his bearded, aged face, his soaked and torn clothes, his calloused hands, and there was something in that look that made Richard feel like an insect being examined under a magnifying glass. For a moment, something passed across Valerie's face, a confused expression as if she were trying to remember something important but couldn't, and she tilted her head slightly as she studied Richard's features. "Have we met before?" Valerie suddenly asked, frowning her perfectly drawn eyebrows. Richard felt his heart skip a beat but kept his expression neutral and shook his head negatively, unable to speak. Valerie continued observing for a few more seconds, then shrugged as if deciding it didn't matter, and turned back to Frank with that fake smile still pasted on her face. "Frank, darling, after you settle our guests, we really need to talk about the papers the lawyer sent today," she said, placing special emphasis on the word guests in a way that made it clear she considered Richard and Michael anything but that. Frank just nodded, seeming too exhausted to continue the discussion, and gestured for Richard to follow him toward the stairs. Richard began climbing the steps slowly, holding Michael against his chest and feeling his legs shake with each step. 5 years of malnutrition and life on the streets had taken their toll on the body that was once strong and healthy. Behind him, Richard could feel Valerie's eyes burning into his back, and when Michael whispered something in his ear, Richard lowered his face to hear better. "Grandpa, that lady isn't nice," murmured the boy, and Richard held his grandson a little tighter. "I know, my child, I know, but the man is kind, so we'll accept his help for one night," Richard whispered back. Michael nodded against his neck and whispered something that made Richard's heart tighten with emotion. "Thank you, Grandpa, you're the best man in the world," said the boy with that unwavering faith that only children possess, even after everything they had been through together. Richard had to blink several times to hold back the tears that threatened to overflow, because he didn't feel anywhere near the best man in the world. In fact, he felt like the biggest failure who had ever walked the earth. But if Michael still believed in him, then he had to keep trying. "You're also the best grandson in the world," Richard replied with a choked voice. Frank guided them through the second floor along a hallway, with carpet even more worn than in the lobby, passing several numbered doors until they reached almost the end, where a solitary door had the number 237 in faded golden digits. Frank pulled a master key from his pocket and unlocked the door, pushing it open to reveal a simple but clean room with a double bed covered by a faded blue comforter, an old dark wood wardrobe, a worn armchair near the window, and a small bathroom whose half-open door revealed white tiles. "It's not much, "But there's hot water and the towels are in the bathroom cabinet," said Frank, turning on the light that illuminated the room with a yellowish glow. Richard entered slowly, still holding Michael, and for the first time in 5 years felt the luxury of being inside a real room with a real bed and a solid roof over their heads. "It's perfect, thank you very much, sir," said Richard, his voice coming out hoarse with emotion. Frank gave a small, tired smile and was about to leave when he stopped at the door and looked back. "There are extra blankets on the top shelf of the wardrobe, and I'll bring you something to eat," said Frank, and then hesitated before adding, "I'm sorry about Valerie. She's stressed about the hotel bills, but she's not a bad person." Richard nodded even though he didn't completely believe the last part, and Frank gently closed the door, leaving them alone. Richard walked to the bed and carefully laid Michael down. The boy barely moved, so exhausted and feverish he was, and Richard quickly went to the bathroom to get clean towels. He carefully removed Michael's soaked clothes, dried his grandson's small body that was too warm, and wrapped him in one of the soft towels before covering him with the comforter. Michael briefly opened his eyes and smiled weakly at his grandfather, and Richard kissed his burning forehead. "Rest now, my prince. Grandpa's going to take a quick shower and stay right here by your side," said Richard, stroking the boy's damp hair. The hot shower was the closest thing to paradise Richard had experienced in 5 long years, and he stayed under the shower until the water began to cool. When he returned to the room wrapped in a towel and wearing his own still damp clothes because he had no others, Richard checked that Michael was sleeping deeply, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm that still worried him, but was better than before. Richard sat in the armchair near the window, from where he could see both his grandson and the street below still being punished by the rain, and for the first time in a long time allowed himself to relax a little. His body ached in places he didn't even know existed. His stomach complained of hunger, but it was all right because Michael was in a warm bed and had a roof over his head. Richard closed his eyes for a moment, just resting, when he heard muffled footsteps in the hallway outside. He opened his eyes and became completely still, listening, and then recognized Valerie's voice speaking quietly on the phone. "No, not that room if he finds," she whispered, and Richard frowned in confusion about what she could be talking about. There was a pause, and then her voice continued, more urgent now. "We have a problem. I need you to come to the hotel now, early tomorrow, without fail." Richard silently got up from the armchair and walked to the door, pressing his ear against the wood. 237, yes, that damned room I told you to lock," said Valerie, with barely contained anger in her voice. Richard felt a shiver run down his spine, completely confused about why the room number would cause such a reaction. He heard Valerie's footsteps move away down the corridor, then silence, and was about to return to the armchair when he heard something different, footsteps returning, slower, more careful. Richard remained paralyzed with his ear still pressed against the door when he saw the shadow of 2 feet stop right outside, projected by the gap under the door. Valerie was there on the other side, completely silent, and Richard barely dared to breathe. Seconds dragged like hours, until finally the shadow moved, the footsteps retreated, and Richard heard Valerie go up the stairs to the 3rd floor, where presumably the owner's apartments were located. Richard let out the breath he was holding and moved away from the door, his heart beating erratically in his chest. There was something very wrong happening in that hotel. He knew that for certain, and the way Valerie had reacted to the room number, the urgent call, the way she had watched them, all of this triggered alarms in Richard's head. He walked to the window and looked outside, seeing the storm finally beginning to subside, and thought about all the storms he had faced in life. "Just one night," Richard whispered to himself. "Tomorrow we leave this place and never come back." Cheers. But as he observed the street below, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen, something that would change everything once again. Dawn had arrived silently at Hotel San Miguel, bringing with it that heavy quietness that exists only in the darkest hours before sunrise, when the whole world seems to hold its breath. Michael slowly opened his eyes, still feeling the fever pulsing in his temples like small hammer blows, but not as intense as before, and looked around the dark room trying to remember where he was. The bed was too soft to be the cardboard he usually slept on, the ceiling was too close to be the open sky, and then the memories of the previous night returned in flashes: the rain, the kind man, the hotel, the mean woman. In the armchair near the window, Richard was sleeping deeply for the first time in weeks, his head tilted to the side and his mouth slightly open while soft snores escaped from his cracked lips. Michael observed his grandfather for a long moment, seeing the deep lines of worry that marked that face even in sleep, the calloused hands resting on his lap, and felt a wave of love so strong it almost hurt. He didn't want to wake Richard. He knew the old man desperately needed rest, so he decided to explore the room a little by himself, just to pass time until the sun rose. "Grandpa deserves to sleep in peace," thought Michael, carefully slipping out of bed. The wooden floor was cold under his bare feet as he walked along the edge of the room, examining every detail with a child's natural curiosity. There was an old dark wood wardrobe that creaked slightly when Michael touched it, a dresser with drawers that he opened and found empty, except for a yellowed tissue paper at the bottom, and on the wall opposite the bed hung a framed picture showing a seascape faded by time. Michael approached the picture, tilting his head to study it better in the dim light, and noticed that the frame was crooked, hanging more on one side than the other, as if someone had bumped into it long ago and never bothered to straighten it. He extended his small hands to adjust the picture, trying to make it straight, but when he touched it, the frame moved more than it should, revealing that it wasn't firmly attached to the wall. Carefully, Michael pulled lightly and the picture came loose, being lighter than it seemed, and behind it the wallpaper was peeling and torn in some places. It was then that Michael saw, hidden behind the loose wallpaper, a small opening in the wall, as if someone had removed some bricks or made a hole there on purpose. "What is this?" Michael whispered to himself, his heart racing with that mixture of fear and excitement that children feel when discovering something secret. He carefully placed the picture on the floor against the wall and turned his attention to the hidden opening, cautiously inserting his small hand inside. His fingers touched something hard and cold, rusty metal, and Michael pulled slowly until he could see what it was. A small, antique safe, the kind that opens with a rotating combination, but the door was ajar, as if someone had forgotten to close it completely or simply didn't care. Rust covered the edges of the safe, and Michael had to use force to open the door completely, the metal creaking in protest and making a noise that seemed thunderous in the silence of the room. He quickly looked at Richard, who continued sleeping deeply, and then turned his attention to the contents of the safe. Inside was a brown leather folder worn by time, tied with a cord that was already coming apart, and when Michael pulled it out, he felt the weight of many papers inside it. His hands trembled slightly as he untied the cord, not out of fear but from a strange sensation that he was about to discover something important, something that would change everything. The folder opened, revealing yellowed documents, old photographs with curled edges, and on top of everything an identification badge with a photo of a man Michael recognized immediately. "Grandpa," he whispered, holding the badge against the dim light coming through the window. The photo on the badge showed Richard Montgomery much younger, perhaps 40. Dark hair, perfectly combed, clean-shaven face, confident smile, wearing an impeccable suit and tie. The words printed below the photo clearly stated, "Richard Montgomery, owner, Emperor Hotel," and Michael felt his heart race because that was the hotel his grandfather always mentioned with that deep sadness in his eyes. The hotel they had lost, the place where everything began to fall apart. Michael looked again at Richard sleeping in the armchair, then at the badge in his hands, and a question hammered in his head. Why was his grandfather's badge hidden in this room, in this different hotel, inside a secret safe? He began to carefully sift through the other documents, finding photos of the Emperor Hotel in all its glory, a beautiful 5-story building with marble facade and mirrored glass doors, completely different from the decaying San Miguel Hotel where they were now. There were photos of Richard cutting ribbons at openings, receiving important guests, posing proudly at reception, and in many of these photos appeared a woman by his side, always smiling, always touching Richard's arm possessively. Michael took one of these photos and brought it close to his face, narrowing his eyes to see better, and even with the different hair, darker and pulled into a severe bun, and with thick-framed glasses covering half of her face, he recognized those cold eyes. "The bad woman," whispered Michael, feeling a shiver run down his spine. There were more photos, dozens of them, and in each one the same woman appeared next to different men in different places, always smiling that smile that didn't reach her eyes. In some photos, she had short blonde hair, in others, long brown hair. In one, she wore a red wig, but the eyes were always the same, cold and calculating even when she smiled. Beside each photo were handwritten notes in a nervous and hurried handwriting, names of places, dates, money values, addresses, and Michael didn't fully understand what it all meant, but instinctively knew it was something very bad. There were property transfer documents with signatures that seemed too shaky, contracts with entire paragraphs circled in red pen, and sheets of paper with numbers and calculations that made no sense to the boy, but clearly told a story of theft and deceit. Michael found a particularly revealing photo where the woman was sitting in an elegant restaurant next to a grey-haired man, and on the back someone had written, "Case number 1, Bella Vista Restaurant, 200,000. The boy swallowed hard and turned more pages, finding similar stories. Case number 2, Maritime Hotel, 150,000. Case number 3, Valley Inn, 80,000, and so on, a list of victims and values that made Michael feel sick. Grandpa needs to see this, he thought, standing up with the folder in his hands and walking to the armchair where Richard slept. Michael gently touched his grandfather's shoulder, softly calling his name until Richard woke with a start, eyes wide and confused for a moment, before recognizing where he was. "Michael, what is it? Are you feeling sick again?" asked Richard, immediately alert and touching his grandson's forehead to check his temperature. Michael shook his head and placed the folder in his grandfather's lap, opening it to reveal the contents while saying in a voice trembling with emotion, "Grandpa, look at this. I found it hidden behind that painting," he said, pointing to the wall where the painting now rested on the floor. Richard looked at the folder, then at his grandson's anxious face, and began to examine the documents with hands that trembled more with each page he turned. Michael watched his grandfather's face change from confusion to shock, from shock to horror, from horror to a mixture of anger and fear that made the boy momentarily regret having awakened the old man. Richard held his own badge between his fingers, staring at the photo of who he used to be, and then his eyes fixed on one of the photos where the woman appeared by his side at the Emperor Hotel. His lips began to tremble, his hands shook so much they almost dropped the photo, and when he finally spoke, his voice came out as a strangled whisper full of horror and recognition. "My God! She was using another name, Katrina Blackwell, but it's her, the eyes, the smile, it's her. The woman who destroyed our family," said Richard, and tears began to stream down his face. Michael felt his own heart tighten seeing his grandfather so shaken, but there were questions that needed answers, so he asked with his childlike voice full of genuine confusion, "Grandpa, why were these things hidden here in this hotel if they're about your old hotel?" asked Michael, sitting on the arm of the armchair and holding his grandfather's free hand. Richard breathed deeply several times, trying to control himself, wiping away tears with the back of his hand, while his brain worked frantically connecting dots that he had never considered before. He looked around room 237, remembering Valerie's strange reaction the night before, when Frank mentioned this specific number, and suddenly everything began to make terrible and perfect sense. She must have hidden this here years ago, when she pulled previous scams, must have forgotten or couldn't come back for it, Michael. "She's doing the same thing to the good man," said Richard, his voice gaining urgency as the horrible truth unfolded before him. He continued flipping through the documents frantically, finding contracts and papers that mentioned the San Miguel Hotel, seeing the same scam structure that had destroyed his own life being applied again, the same hidden clauses, the same legal tricks, the same meticulous manipulation. Richard felt a wave of pure panic invade his chest because he knew exactly how that story would end, with Frank losing everything just as he had lost, with another family being destroyed by that heartless woman. "We need to get out of here now. Grab our things and leave before she finds out," said Richard, rising abruptly from the armchair. But Michael didn't move, remaining seated on the arm of the chair with an expression of determination that seemed too big for such a small face. "Grandpa, you always taught me that good men don't run from doing the right thing. That man was kind to us, gave us shelter when we were freezing cold, saved us. We need to warn him of the danger," said Michael, and his words hit Richard like punches to the stomach. The old man stopped in the middle of the room, torn between the survival instinct that screamed to flee and the voice of conscience that sounded exactly like his deceased son, Michael's father, who had always been a man of unwavering principles. Richard looked at his grandson and saw so much of his dead son in that boy that he had to hold back a sob. The same righteous stubbornness, the same moral courage, the same inability to turn his back on someone who needed help. "Michael, you don't understand. This woman is dangerous. She destroyed us once. She will," Richard began. But the words died in his throat because he knew his grandson was right. Richard's hands were shaking violently now, not just from fear but from repressed anger, from trauma resurging, from 5 years of pain and loss being forced to the surface again. Cold sweat ran down his temples despite the cool room, and he could feel his heart beating so hard it seemed to want to leap out of his chest. "I don't know if I can face her again, my son. I simply don't know if I have that strength," said Richard, and it was the most honest and vulnerable admission he had ever made. Michael got down from the arm of the chair and walked to his grandfather, holding the 2 large calloused hands between his own small hands, warm from the fever that still persisted. "Grandpa, you're the bravest man I know. When Dad and Grandma were gone, you didn't abandon me. When we lost our home, you held my hand. When I was hungry, you gave me your food. When I was cold, you covered me with your coat. You never gave up on me. Please don't give up on that good man," said Michael. And each word was an arrow straight to Richard's heart. The old man looked into his grandson's eyes, those large dark eyes full of unwavering faith, and felt something change inside him, as if a part of him that had been dead for 5 years began to breathe again. Richard took a deep breath, then an even deeper one, feeling the air fill his lungs and clear some of the fog of panic that clouded his thinking. He looked at the folder with documents scattered on the armchair, then at the empty safe still visible behind the fallen painting, and finally back to Michael, who was watching him with transparent hope on his face. "You're right, my son, we'll warn the man. But we need concrete evidence. We can't simply arrive and accuse without being able to show the truth," said Richard, and he felt determination replace the fear in his chest. Michael smiled, a small but genuine smile that lit up his fever-pale face, and nodded enthusiastically. Richard looked out the window and saw that the sky was beginning to lighten with that bluish-grey tone that precedes dawn. It must have been around 5 in the morning, and the hotel was still immersed in deep silence. He took the folder and began organizing the documents meticulously, separating what was about the Emperor Hotel from what was about other scams, from what was specifically about the San Miguel Hotel. His hands were still shaking, but now it was from adrenaline mixed with purpose, and Richard felt his mind beginning to work the way it did long ago when he was a successful businessman, analytical and strategic. "Michael, we need to compare these old documents with Frank's current ones, see if the pattern repeats. If the clauses are the same, this will prove that she's running the same scam," said Richard, speaking more to himself than to his grandson while planning the next steps. Michael agreed and asked where they would find Frank's current documents, and Richard smiled for the first time in hours, a sad but determined smile. "Hotels have administrative offices, usually on the first floor near reception. I used to be a hotelier, remember? I know the structure of these places like the back of my hand," said Richard, feeling memories of his previous life resurface with surprising clarity. They prepared in silence, Richard putting on his dry but still shabby clothes, Michael wrapped in a blanket because his own clothes were still damp hanging in the bathroom. Richard opened the door slowly, peeking into the corridor to ensure it was empty, and then they left like shadows, closing the door behind them without making noise. The corridor was dark except for small emergency lights that created yellowish circles on the worn carpet every few meters, and Richard held Michael's hand as they walked toward the stairs. They descended the steps one by one, Richard testing each before putting his full weight, because old stairs always creaked and he didn't want to wake anyone. The lobby was even quieter than the corridor, almost sepulchral in its stillness, and Richard scanned the area with his eyes looking for the administrative office. He found it exactly where he expected, a wooden door with frosted glass next to the main reception, with a small sign that said "Administration" hanging crookedly. Richard walked to the door and turned the knob slowly, expecting to find it locked, but to his surprise it opened easily, revealing a small and messy office. "Administrative negligence," Richard muttered, shaking his head disapprovingly even in the current situation. "No serious hotelier leaves the office unlocked at night. Anyone could enter." The office had a large wooden desk, covered with papers, stacked folders, unpaid bills with red notices, and an old computer that probably barely worked. Richard and Michael entered, and Richard closed the door behind them, turning on only a small desk lamp to have enough light without drawing attention. He began to search through the files meticulously, opening drawers and examining documents, while Michael held the old folder they had brought from the room. Richard quickly found what he was looking for, a thick folder labeled Contracts and Agreements, and when he opened it, he felt his stomach turn because he immediately recognized the format, the structure, even the font used in the documents. "Michael, look. These contracts here, the values don't match what's written at the top. Look here in the fine print at the footer. There are hidden clauses that change everything. It's exactly what she did to me," said Richard, his voice an intense whisper as he placed the old documents beside the new ones. Michael leaned over the desk, his eyes scanning the papers even without fully understanding what they meant. But he could see the similarities his grandfather pointed out, the same phrases, the same paragraph structures, as if someone had used a template and merely changed the names. Richard took a pen from the desk and began making frantic notes on a notepad he found, circling clauses, highlighting discrepant values, drawing arrows connecting old documents to the new ones. "She's driving Frank to bankruptcy the same way she drove me, making him sign property transfers disguised as loans, creating fake debts in his name. It's a perfect scam because when he realizes it, he will have legally lost everything," said Richard, feeling anger boiling in his veins. It was then that Richard opened a side drawer and found something that seemed like a gift from destiny, an old yellow disposable camera, probably forgotten there years ago by some employee. He took the camera and verified it still had film inside, at least 15 photos available according to the counter on the back, and almost laughed at the irony that old technology would be saving the day in the era of smartphones that he didn't own. Richard started photographing everything. First the documents side by side showing the similarities, then specific pages of Frank's contracts with the problematic clauses, then the old photos of Valerie or Katrina, or however many names she used. Michael helped by organizing the papers as his grandfather finished photographing, carefully stacking everything so they could put it back without leaving obvious traces that they had been there. Richard was so focused on the task, bent over the desk whispering intensely to Michael while pointing out important details in the documents, that he didn't hear the footsteps in the corridor outside. Michael saw something first, a movement through the frosted glass of the door, and pulled his grandfather's sleeve trying to alert him, but it was too late. "Grandpa, someone's coming," Michael whispered urgently, but Richard was still taking the last photo. Across the lobby, Frank had just come down from his apartment on the 3rd floor after a night of practically no sleep. He hadn't been able to sleep properly, his mind spinning with concerns about the hotel accounts, about the papers Valerie insisted he sign, about the strange guests he had sheltered against his fiancée's wishes, and finally gave up trying to sleep when the clock struck 5:30 in the morning. Frank decided to check if Richard and Michael were okay. Maybe bring them coffee and something to eat, because the image of that feverish child and that dignified but shattered old man wouldn't leave his head. He prepared a simple tray with hot coffee, bread, butter, and some cookies he found in the kitchen, and went up to the 2nd floor, carefully balancing everything. When he reached the hallway leading to room 237, Frank noticed the door was ajar, and there was no movement or sound coming from inside, which was strange considering it was so early. He approached and peeked inside to see the unmade but empty bed, the bathroom with the door open and lights off, and absolutely no sign of Richard or Michael. Frank felt worry tighten his chest, thinking they might have left during the night, but then heard muffled voices coming from somewhere downstairs, voices whispering urgently. He went back down the stairs following the sound, and that's when he realized it was coming from the administrative office. What would they be doing in the office, Frank thought, feeling the first flash of distrust. Frank approached the office door and saw through the frosted glass 2 silhouettes bent over his desk, surrounded by scattered papers, and immediately recognized Richard and Michael. His heart began to beat faster as he observed the scene, trying to understand what they were doing there at that hour of the morning, searching through his documents without permission. The dim light from the lamp created long shadows that made the scene appear even more suspicious, almost sinister, and Frank felt a confused mixture of emotions cross his chest: fear, anger, disappointment, confusion. What are they doing? Why are they in my documents? Are they planning to rob us? He thought, feeling distrust grow like a weed in his chest. Richard was bent over Michael, whispering intensely and making frantic notes. And to someone who didn't know the context, the scene really did look criminal. It looked exactly like what Valerie had warned could happen. Frank stood paralyzed there for several seconds, his mind struggling between the compassion he had felt the night before and the suspicious evidence before his eyes. And it was in this moment of hesitation that he felt a presence behind him. He turned and found Valerie standing a few meters away, wearing a blue silk robe with her hair loose over her shoulders, and there was something in the small smile curving her lips that made Frank feel a shiver. "I knew it," she whispered, approaching and looking through the frosted glass into the office. Valerie placed a hand on Frank's arm and squeezed lightly, her voice coming out low but loaded with false concern as she pointed to Richard and Michael through the glass. "Look what they're doing, Frank. Searching through your documents, probably looking for values, passwords, information for a scam. I warned you yesterday, but you didn't want to listen to me," said Valerie, each word calculated to plant seeds of doubt and anger. Frank looked from Valerie to the scene inside the office, his stomach turning because part of him still wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation, but the evidence was undeniable. They had invaded his private space, were going through his confidential documents, making notes as if they were planning something. Valerie continued whispering poison in his ear, telling him how she had tried to warn him about the dangers of trusting strangers, how desperate people were capable of anything, how he was being too naive and kind for his own good. Frank felt anger beginning to boil inside him, not just for Richard and Michael's supposed betrayal, but also for the feeling of being made a fool, of having his kindness taken advantage of and thrown back in his face. He took a step toward the office door, his hand already reaching for the doorknob, when Valerie held him again and said with urgency, "Confront them now, Frank, before they can make up excuses or hide what they're doing. Catch them red-handed," she whispered, and Frank nodded, taking a deep breath. Frank opened the office door abruptly, making it slam against the wall, and his voice came out much louder and firmer than he himself expected. "What are you doing here?" Frank shouted, and saw Richard and Michael turn around startled, papers slipping from Richard's hands and falling to the floor in a cascade of yellowed documents. Richard immediately positioned himself in front of Michael instinctively, protecting his grandson with his own body, and there was genuine fear in his eyes, but also something else, something that seemed like desperation to not be misunderstood. Frank entered the office with Valerie right behind, and he looked at the mess of papers scattered on his desk, at the disposable camera Richard was still holding, at the frantic notes on the notepad, and felt his anger grow even more. "I trusted you, gave you shelter when you were freezing to death out there, and you're robbing me, invading my office, going through my private documents," said Frank, his voice trembling with emotion mixed with anger and deep disappointment. Richard raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, palms facing Frank, and there was dignity trembling in every line of his body despite the obvious fear. "No, sir, please listen to me. I can explain all of this. It's not what it seems," Richard began, but Valerie interrupted him, quickly entering the office. Valerie swept her eyes across the office, and when she saw the old photographs scattered on the floor, some showing herself younger and with a different appearance, her entire face contracted. For a fraction of a second, her mask completely fell away and Frank saw pure panic cross her blue eyes, but she recovered so quickly that he thought he had imagined it. "Thieves, they broke into the office in the middle of the night. Frank, call the police now. Look, they even brought a folder from somewhere else to make it seem like they found these things here. It's all staged for a scam," shouted Valerie, accusingly pointing at Richard and Michael. Richard shook his head violently, his entire body trembling now, and when he spoke his voice came out desperate but firm. "No, these documents were here in room 237, hidden behind the painting on the wall, please. I'm not a thief. I'm Richard Montgomery. And this woman," he said, turning and pointing at Valerie with a trembling finger that seemed as accusatory as a blade. Richard took a deep breath, trying to control the tremor in his voice, and continued, each word coming out laden with pain and anger accumulated over 5 years. "She destroyed my life 5 years ago. She was using the name Katrina Blackwell at that time, and now she's doing exactly the same thing to you. The same scam, the same lies, the same tricks, Richard said, and tears began to stream down his face. The silence that followed was so dense and heavy that it seemed to suck all the air out of the office, and Frank looked from Richard to Valerie, trying to process the impossible accusations. Valerie let her own tears flow, tears that seemed perfectly genuine as she brought a hand to her chest in a gesture of shock and deep hurt. "Frank, this man is clearly mentally disturbed. Look at the state of him, living on the streets, probably with psychiatric problems, making up absurd stories to extort us or cause trouble. I've never seen this man in my life, never used another name. This is pure madness," said Valerie, her voice coming out broken and hurt in a masterful way. Richard shook his head frantically and bent down to pick up some of the documents that had fallen on the floor, his hands trembling so much he could barely hold them. "Look at the photos. See the signatures on the contracts, compare your contracts with my old ones, they're identical. The same hidden clauses, the same legal tricks. She used the exact same template," Richard pleaded, extending the papers to Frank. But before Frank could take the documents, Valerie quickly moved forward and snatched the entire folder from Richard's hands with a sudden and violent movement. "These documents are fake. You fabricated all of this. You probably spent the whole night creating this farce to try to extort us," Valerie shouted, clutching the folder against her chest. It was then that Michael, who had been quiet and frightened behind his grandfather all this time, stepped forward and shouted with all the strength his small lungs would allow. "No, my grandfather doesn't lie. He's the most honest man in the world. It was this evil woman who lied and stole everything from him. She made my father die. She made my grandmother die. She put us on the street, and now she wants to do the same to you," Michael shouted, his cheeks flushed with fever and his eyes shining with tears of frustration and anger. Frank looked at that small boy defending his grandfather with such passion, so clearly sick, but still finding courage to shout the truth, and felt something stir in his chest. But then Valerie turned to him and used her final weapon, placing a hand on Frank's face and forcing him to look directly into her blue eyes full of fake tears. "Frank, if you believe them instead of me, your fiancée, the woman who has been by your side for 2 years, trying to save this hotel with you, if you choose 2 lying beggars instead of me, then our relationship is over right now, this very moment. Choose me or these lying beggars," said Valerie, and there was absolute ultimatum in her voice. Frank was paralyzed between the two sides, looking from Valerie to Richard and Michael, seeing tears on all faces, feeling the impossible weight of the choice on his shoulders. "Please, sir, just look at the documents, just compare them. That's all I ask," Richard pleaded one last time. Frank closed his eyes tightly, took several deep breaths while his heart beat erratically, and when he opened his eyes again, he had made a decision that would shatter everything. "Richard, Michael, I'm sorry, but you need to leave now. Get out of my hotel immediately," said Frank, and every word seemed to tear a piece of his soul. Richard staggered backward as if he had taken a physical punch to the stomach, his face contorting into an expression of pain so deep it was almost unbearable to watch. Michael let out a sound that was half sob, half scream, and clung to his grandfather's leg, hiding his face in the worn clothes as he cried. Valerie immediately adopted an expression of barely disguised satisfaction and walked to the office door, shouting into the hallway. "Security! Come to the office now. We have intruders who need to be escorted off the property," she shouted, her voice echoing through the silent lobby. 2 uniformed men appeared quickly, probably having been called by Valerie even before the confrontation, and entered the office looking from Frank to Richard and Michael. "Escort these people out of the hotel immediately, and make sure they don't take anything that isn't theirs," Valerie ordered, pointing to Richard and Michael as if they were dangerous criminals. One of the security guards approached Richard and touched his arm, and Richard simply crumbled, his shoulders falling, his head lowering, all the air leaving his body like air from a punctured balloon. The security guards escorted Richard and Michael back to the lobby of the Hotel San Miguel. Richard kept his head high, despite the difficult situation, protecting his grandson as they left. The lobby that had been a refuge the night before now seemed like a courtroom, with the few guests who were having breakfast, stopping eating to observe the embarrassing scene unfolding before them. Richard could feel all those eyes judging, weighing, condemning, seeing only an old beggar and a child being expelled for suspicious behavior, knowing nothing of the real truth behind that situation. Michael cried softly, clinging to his grandfather's waist, his sobs muffled against the worn fabric of Richard's shirt, and each sound of that crying was like a knife being repeatedly stabbed into the old man's heart. Richard, however, kept his head high with all the dignity he could still gather, his shoulders back and his gaze fixed on the front door, because even though he had lost everything once again, he would not give Valerie the satisfaction of seeing him completely broken. "Keep your head up, Michael. We did nothing wrong," Richard whispered to his grandson, feeling his own tears threatening to overflow. Valerie came down the stairs from the second floor at that exact moment, holding the document folder against her chest, as if it were a trophy won in battle. She walked over to Frank, who was standing near the reception, with a devastated expression on his face, and placed a hand on his shoulder while speaking loudly enough for everyone in the lobby to hear clearly. "Frank, darling, I'll keep this safe in our personal vault. They're probably forgeries they brought from somewhere to try to scam us," said Valerie, her voice full of that fake sweetness that made Richard feel nauseous. Frank just nodded without saying anything, his eyes avoiding Richard's, and there was something in his body language that suggested internal conflict, as if part of him knew he had made the wrong decision, but was too proud or too scared to admit it. The security guards continued pushing Richard and Michael gently but firmly toward the door, and when they reached the threshold, Richard turned one last time, looking Frank directly in the eyes. There was so much he wanted to say, so many warnings he wanted to shout, so much anger and frustration stuck in his throat, but when he opened his mouth, only the most important words managed to come out. "I was once like you, a good man who trusted the wrong person. When you realize the truth, it will be too late, just as it was for me and my family," said Richard, and each word came out loaded with lived pain and bitter wisdom. Frank finally met Richard's eyes, and for a brief second something passed between them. A silent recognition, a doubt planted, but then Valerie pulled Frank's arm, turning his attention away. The hotel door closed behind Richard and Michael with a final sound that echoed like a death sentence, and they found themselves again on the street under a fine rain that had replaced the previous night's storm. The sky was grey and low, promising more water, and Richard pulled Michael close as they began to walk slowly without specific direction, just moving away from that place of humiliation. Both their clothes were still damp from the night before, and the fine rain now soaked them again, and Richard felt the cold penetrate to his 65-year-old bones that couldn't take as much as before. Michael trembled against him, partly from the cold and partly from the sobs that still shook his small body, and Richard didn't know what to say to comfort the boy when he himself felt completely defeated. They walked several blocks until they reached a small square with some wooden benches worn by time, and a fountain in the center that hadn't worked in years. Richard let himself fall heavily onto one of the benches, pulling Michael to sit beside him, and for several minutes neither said anything, just sat there under the fine rain being completely miserable. "I failed again, Michael. Failed to protect you, failed to help that good man, failed at everything," thought Richard, closing his eyes tightly. It was Michael who broke the silence first, his voice small but surprisingly firm considering he had just cried so much. "Grandpa, we can't give up, not now. Not when we know the truth," said Michael, wiping his wet face with the back of his hand. Richard opened his eyes and looked at his grandson, seeing determination where he expected to see only defeat, and felt something stir in his chest despite all the despair. "Michael, nobody believes us. We're just beggars in everyone's eyes. She destroyed the evidence, took all those documents and photos and will make them disappear. We have nothing left to show we're telling the truth," said Richard, his voice coming out tired and defeated. Michael shook his head vigorously, those dark eyes shining with something Richard couldn't fully identify, but that seemed dangerously close to hope. "But Grandpa, you always taught me that the truth always comes out, no matter how long it takes. We just need to be smarter than her, find another way to prove it," said Michael. And Richard looked at that 9-year-old boy, refusing to give up, even when everything seemed lost. Something inside Richard, something that had been dead for a long time, began to awaken again. A spark of fight, of resistance, of pure stubbornness that refused to let that woman win again. "You're right, my child, you're absolutely right," said Richard, feeling different tears running down his face, tears of pride instead of defeat. Michael was quiet for a moment, his face furrowing in deep concentration, the way children do when they're thinking very intensely about something important. "Grandpa, what if we could make her confess, make her tell the truth about the scam and record everything?" Michael suddenly asked, his eyes lighting up with the idea. Richard blinked several times, processing the suggestion, wanting to believe it was possible, but unable to see how. "How, my son? We have nothing, not even a cell phone to record, no money to buy one, we have absolutely nothing," said Richard, hating to throw cold water on his grandson's hope, but being realistic about their situation. Michael jumped off the bench suddenly, his eyes even brighter now, and pointed to a specific direction in the square. "The grocery store owner. He has an old recorder he uses to listen to the radio while he works. He's always been kind to me, Grandpa," said Michael, practically jumping with excitement now. Richard frowned in confusion, not understanding who his grandson was talking about, and Michael quickly explained about the merchant who always let him take fruits that were going to spoil, who sometimes gave old but still good bread, who treated Michael as a human being instead of invisible trash in the streets. "He has a recorder, Grandpa. I've seen it several times. He's always listening to news or music while organizing the store," said Michael, holding his grandfather's hands. Richard looked in the direction Michael was pointing and saw a small, humble grocery store a few blocks away, with fruits and vegetables stacked in wooden crates out front. Hope was dangerous, Richard knew that. Hope could hurt more than defeat itself when it ended up being crushed. But looking at his grandson's face, so full of faith, he couldn't say no. "Let's go then. Let's talk to this kind man and see if he can help us," said Richard, getting up from the bench with difficulty. They walked together across the square and through the streets until they reached the grocery store, and Richard stayed on the sidewalk while Michael timidly entered the shop. Through the open door, Richard could see a man of about 60, with graying hair and a prominent belly, organizing crates of tomatoes, and when the man saw Michael, his entire face lit up with a genuine smile. "Hi, Michael, it's been a while. I was worried about you with all that rain yesterday," said the merchant, wiping his hands on a stained apron. Michael approached slowly, his hands interlaced in front of his body in a nervous gesture, and when he spoke, his voice came out small and hesitant. "I need a very big favor. It's very important," said Michael, looking at the ground. The merchant crouched in front of Michael to be at the boy's eye level, his thick eyebrows coming together in genuine concern. "Of course, Michael. What do you need? Are you hungry? There are fresh fruits here I can give you," asked the man, already turning to grab an apple. Michael shook his head and began to explain the situation in a simplified, childish version, talking about the bad woman who destroyed his family, about finding evidence hidden in the hotel, about nobody believing them because they were homeless, about needing to record a confession to save another good man. The merchant listened to everything attentively, his eyes moving from Michael to Richard on the sidewalk and back, and when the boy finished speaking, there were tears in the corners of the older man's eyes. "This woman hurt your family?" asked the merchant, his voice thickening with emotion. Michael nodded vigorously, his own tears beginning to fall again as he responded. "She destroyed our entire family, made my father and grandmother die of heartbreak, took everything from my grandfather, and now she's going to do the same thing to another good person if we can't prove the truth," said Michael, and the merchant pulled the boy into a quick but tight hug. The merchant stood up and walked to the back of the store, searching through a shelf full of various objects until he found what he was looking for and came back holding an old portable recorder. The device was one of those models from the 90s, with large grey plastic buttons and a compartment for cassette tapes, somewhat scratched but clearly functional. "It was my son's when he was a teenager. He hasn't used it in years, but it still works perfectly. You can keep it. No need to return it," said the merchant, placing the recorder in Michael's small hands. The boy held the device as if it were the most precious treasure in the world, his eyes wide with gratitude and surprise. "But be very careful, Michael. Bad people are dangerous, especially when they feel cornered. Don't do anything that could hurt you," said the merchant, his voice serious and concerned. Michael nodded, promising to be careful, and then threw himself into the merchant's arms in a tight hug. "Thank you, sir. You are a true angel. One day when things get better, I will pay you back for everything you've done for me," said Michael, his voice muffled against the man's apron. The shopkeeper just stroked the boy's hair and gently pushed him toward the door where Richard was waiting. Go, do what you need to do, but come back here afterwards to tell me how it ended. Deal, said the shopkeeper, and Michael nodded in agreement. Back in the square, Richard and Michael sat on the same bench as before, but now there was renewed purpose in both as they examined the old tape recorder. Richard turned the device in his hands, checking that there was a cassette tape inside and that the battery still had charge, and tested the buttons, confirming that everything worked. But how are we going to make her confess, Michael? She's too smart, too manipulative. She'll never admit anything knowing we're around, said Richard, returning to the practical reality of the situation. Michael took the recorder back and held it against his chest, his dark eyes fixed on the Hotel San Miguel visible in the distance. Grandpa, children are invisible to bad adults. They never really pay attention to us. She won't even notice me if I'm smart, said Michael, and there was a sad wisdom in these words that no 9-year-old should have. Richard felt his heart tighten because he knew his grandson was right. Years living on the streets had taught them both that people rarely really looked at the homeless, especially children, as if ignoring them made their existence less real. It's dangerous, Michael, if she catches you, if she discovers what you're doing, Richard began. But Michael interrupted him with fierce determination. Grandpa, I need to do this. For my father's memory and Grandma's, for everyone she hurt and destroyed, and for the kind man who helped us yesterday. I need to, said Michael, and there was no room for argument in his voice. Richard hugged his grandson tightly, feeling pride and fear fighting inside his chest, and finally nodded, agreeing to the risky plan. They sat on the bench watching the hotel for almost an hour, planning and waiting for the right moment, when suddenly the front door opened and Valerie rushed out. She was talking on her cell phone, nervously gesturing with her free hand, and even from a distance Richard could see that she was tense and irritated. Valerie walked quickly down the sidewalk and entered a small cafe 2 blocks from the hotel, still talking agitatedly on the phone. Michael looked at his grandfather, and both knew, without needing to speak, that it was now or never. Grandpa, it's time. She's alone and distracted, said Michael, already getting up from the bench. Richard held his grandson's arm for a moment, looking deeply into those eyes that still held innocence despite everything. If you sense danger, any danger, you run out of there immediately, promise me, said Richard, and Michael promised. The boy took the recorder, pressed the red recording button, checking that the tape began to spin, and put the device in the large pocket of the worn coat he was wearing, leaving only the microphone out, disguised among the tatters of the fabric. I'll stay right here watching everything. If there's any problem, I'll go in, said Richard, pointing to the bench where he would keep watch. Michael crossed the street toward the cafe with small but determined steps, his heart beating so hard he could hear the blood pulsing in his ears. The cafe door had a small bell that rang when he entered, but nobody paid much attention to another street child entering the establishment. The cafe was small and cozy, with wooden tables scattered around, and the strong smell of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. Michael quickly scanned the environment and located Valerie sitting at a table in the back, with her back to the entrance, still talking intensely on the phone. There was a thick, decorative column near her table, wrapped in artificial vines and large potted plants, and Michael moved silently in that direction. He was small, too thin, and passed easily between the tables without drawing attention, hiding behind the column where he could perfectly hear Valerie's voice, but was completely hidden from her view. No, he hasn't signed the final papers yet. That old beggar almost ruined everything by showing up with those documents. I need to speed up the process before more problems appear, said Valerie, her voice low but clear. Michael crouched even more behind the plants, holding his breath and hugging the recorder against his chest through the fabric of the pocket. Listen carefully. I need him to sign these papers as soon as possible. After that, we disappear with all the money, and this idiot is left with the debts I created in his name. It's the same scheme as always. Works every time, said Valerie, and there was a coldness in her voice that made Michael tremble. Valerie gave a low and cruel laugh that made the hair on Michael's neck stand up while she continued talking with whoever was on the other end of the line. That old beggar, Richard something. He won't do anything. He's already completely destroyed, evicted and humiliated. And the kid, please, who's going to believe a beggar child? Besides, I destroyed all the evidence. Those documents they found will disappear today. I'll burn everything, said Valerie, and Michael had to bite his own lip to not make a sound out of anger and indignation. It was at that exact moment that a waiter passing near Valerie's table tripped on something and dropped a coffee cup he was carrying on a tray. The sound of the ceramic crashing against the floor echoed throughout the entire cafe, making all customers turn in alarm. Valerie jumped from her chair instantly, hanging up the phone and turning sharply to see what had happened. Her blue eyes swept the entire cafe with sudden suspicion and paranoia, as if a sixth sense was alerting her that something was wrong, and Michael shrank as much as humanly possible behind the plants. The waiter was apologizing profusely, while another employee came with a broom and dustpan to clean up the mess. But Valerie wasn't paying attention to them. Her eyes continued scanning every corner of the cafe. "There's someone here, there's someone watching me," she thought, and began walking slowly toward the column where Michael was hiding. Valerie walked slowly toward the decorative column where Michael was hiding, her high heels making sharp sounds against the cafe's ceramic floor, while her blue eyes scanned every shadow with growing suspicion. Michael was completely petrified with fear, hugging the recorder against his chest through the fabric of his pocket, feeling his heart beating so hard that he was sure everyone in the cafe could hear it. His legs wanted to run but were frozen in place. His lungs burned for air, but he dared not breathe too loudly, and silent tears ran down his face as Valerie got closer and closer. She was only 3 steps away from the column when the waiter who had dropped the cup approached her quickly, still holding the empty tray and with an expression of deep guilt on his face. "Very sorry about the noise, ma'am. It was very careless of me. Can I bring you another coffee on the house to make up for the scare?" said the waiter, positioning himself between Valerie and the column. Valerie stopped, hesitated, looked at the column one last time with that persistent feeling that something was wrong, but then turned her attention to the waiter with a forced smile. "No need, I was just leaving anyway. How much was the coffee I had?" she asked, already taking out her wallet from her designer purse. While Valerie turned to the table where she had been sitting to collect her belongings and pay the bill, Michael saw his only chance to escape without being seen. He spotted a door at the back of the cafe that probably led to a service alley, and with careful and silent movements began to move in that direction, always keeping behind columns and plants, practically crawling at times to avoid being noticed. His heart was beating so fast that he felt dizzy. His hands were cold with sweat holding the precious recorder, and each second seemed to last an eternity as he approached the back door. Valerie was talking with the waiter about the payment method, her back still turned to where Michael had been hiding, and the boy took that moment to reach the door and push it slowly. The door opened noiselessly thanks to well-lubricated hinges, revealing a narrow alley full of garbage bins and crates, and Michael slipped outside, letting the door close silently behind him. As soon as the door closed, he started running, his bare feet hitting the wet pavement of the alley as he ran toward the sunlight at the other end. "I did it, I did it, I did it," he thought repeatedly, hugging the recorder as if it were the most valuable thing in the world. Valerie finished paying for the coffee and turned again toward the decorative column, something still bothering her instincts sharpened by years of running scams. She walked over there and looked behind the column, behind the plants, under the nearby table, but found nothing but empty shadows and her own reflection in the window glass. "I'm becoming paranoid," she thought, shaking her head and leaving the cafe through the front door. But when she reached the sidewalk and looked around casually, her blood froze in her veins, because there, at a considerable distance but still visible, was Michael running desperately across the street toward the square. Valerie stood completely still for a second, processing what she was seeing, and then the realization fell on her, like a bucket of ice water. "That kid, he was inside, he was listening to me, he heard everything," she thought, feeling panic begin to replace surprise. Without thinking twice, Valerie started running after Michael, her high heels making her movements difficult but adrenaline and desperation keeping her fast. "Come back here, kid, come back here now," she shouted, her voice losing all elegant composure and sounding shrill and desperate. Michael looked back over his shoulder and saw Valerie running after him. He turned sharply around a corner, almost slipping on the wet pavement, ran through a narrow alley where he barely fit, jumped over a huge puddle, and continued running toward the square where he had left his grandfather. His lungs burned for air, his legs were beginning to shake from exhaustion, and the fever that still persisted in his body made every movement more difficult. But he couldn't stop, Not now. Not when he had the proof they needed. Valerie screamed behind him, her words getting lost in the wind but the fury in her voice being clear even at a distance, and Michael could hear her heels hitting the ground closer and closer. He turned another corner and finally saw the square ahead, saw the bench where Richard was sitting, and screamed with all the strength that remained in his lungs. "Grandpa, Grandpa, help me," Michael shouted, and saw Richard jump from the bench instantly upon hearing the desperation in his grandson's voice. Richard looked in the direction of the voice and saw Michael running toward him with Valerie in furious pursuit, and something inside the old man ignited like fire. Richard ran toward his grandson faster than he had run in years, ignoring the pain in his old joints and the protests of his muscles atrophied by malnutrition. He reached a corner exactly when Valerie was about to grab Michael by the arm, and Richard placed himself between them, opening his arms to completely block her path. "Stay away from my grandson, don't touch him!" Richard shouted, his voice coming out hoarse but firm and protective. Valerie stopped abruptly, almost tripping on her own heels, breathless and with her face red from exhaustion and anger. Her perfectly arranged blonde hair was disheveled, her makeup smudged by sweat, and her blue eyes shone with murderous fury that she no longer even tried to hide. "That kid was spying on me in the cafe, listening to my private conversations. What are you plotting? What kind of scam are you trying to pull on me?" Valerie shouted, pointing accusingly at Michael, who was hiding behind his grandfather's legs. Richard let out a bitter laugh that had no humor, just incredulity at the absurdity of the situation. "Plotting us, you're the one scamming Frank, stealing from him the same way you stole from me. And you still have the nerve to accuse us," said Richard, his voice trembling with contained anger. People began to stop on the sidewalk around them, attracted by the screams and the dramatic scene unfolding, forming a small circle of curious spectators. Valerie immediately noticed the presence of the audience, and her expression changed as if someone had flipped a switch, instantly transforming from the furious woman to the defenseless victim. She let tears well up in her eyes, brought a trembling hand to her chest, and when she spoke, her voice came out broken and frightened in a masterful way. "This man and this child have been harassing me for days, accusing me of horrible things I never did. Making up stories about me, please. Someone help me, I'm afraid," said Valerie, looking around at the spectators with a pleading expression. Richard was completely stunned by the transformation, by the ease with which she manipulated the perception of everyone around, and saw with horror some people in the crowd begin to look at him with suspicion and disapproval. Michael ran from where he was and hugged his grandfather's waist tightly, hiding the recorder between their bodies, trembling with fear and exhaustion. A man in the crowd with a respectable appearance in a suit and briefcase stepped forward, pointing at Richard. "Leave the lady alone, old man. Go find something to do instead of harassing women on the street," said the man, and others in the crowd murmured in agreement. Richard felt the familiar powerlessness tightening his throat, that terrible feeling of knowing the truth, but being unable to make anyone believe because his beggar appearance spoke louder than his words. Valerie smiled inside as she watched Richard shrink under the weight of public judgment, savoring yet another victory over the old man who had dared to challenge her. "See, he has nothing against me, just empty accusations from a disturbed man," Valerie said to the crowd, delicately wiping away fake tears. But then a strong voice cut through the air from behind the crowd, a voice Richard immediately recognized. "Samantha Hughes, or should I say Katrina Blackwell, or perhaps Christine Foster, I recognize you," shouted the grocery store merchant, making his way through the crowd. Everyone turned to look at the gray-haired man in a stained apron who was pointing accusingly at Valerie, and Valerie herself visibly paled for a second before trying to regain her composure. The merchant continued walking until he was face to face with her, his eyes full of righteous anger. "You scammed my cousin 3 years ago. He lost the family restaurant we built over 2 generations. I saw your face in the lawsuit documents. You can change your name, but you can't change your face," said the merchant, his voice loaded with emotion. Valerie tried to maintain her composure, but Richard could see panic beginning to crack her perfect mask as she looked from the merchant to the crowd that was now murmuring in confusion. "Sir, you are completely mistaken. You're confusing me with someone else. My name is Valerie Sanders. It always has been. I've never used any other name in my life," said Valerie, but her voice didn't sound as convincing as before. The merchant shook his head vigorously, taking an old wallet from his pocket and removing from it a worn photo showing Valerie with different hair standing next to a smiling man in front of a restaurant. "This is you 3 years ago with my cousin in front of Bella Vista restaurant before you stole everything from him. You change your name and appearance, but the eyes are the same cold, calculating eyes," said the merchant, showing the photo to the people around. The crowd began to murmur louder now, looking from Valerie to the photo and back again, and Richard saw doubt beginning to appear on faces that had previously supported her unconditionally. Valerie realized she was losing control of the narrative and took a step back, her expression changing again from helpless victim to defensive anger. "You're all crazy, completely insane. I'm being harassed by beggars and delusional merchants," she shouted, turning and quickly walking away toward the hotel. Richard, Michael, and the merchant stood there in the square surrounded by the still murmuring crowd, and Michael finally pulled the recorder from his pocket, holding it like a trophy. "Grandpa, I got it. I recorded everything she said on the phone," whispered Michael, and Richard felt tears of pride and relief fill his eyes. He knelt on the sidewalk, hugging his grandson so tightly that he almost lifted him off the ground, crying openly now without shame. "You did it, my boy. You are the bravest and smartest boy in the whole world," said Richard, kissing the top of Michael's feverish head. The merchant approached them and placed a hand on Richard's shoulder, his own eyes shining with emotion. "You need to take this to the police immediately. It's the only way to stop her before she destroys more lives," said the merchant, pointing at the recorder. Richard nodded in agreement, and the three ran off toward the police station 6 blocks away, Michael holding the precious recorder against his chest. When they arrived at the station, breathless and sweaty, they found only one clerk on duty sitting behind a desk covered with papers, typing on an old computer with 2 fingers. "Please, we need to speak to the sheriff urgently. We have evidence of a serious crime happening now," said Richard, leaning his hands on the desk to catch his breath. The clerk looked at the ragged trio with that expression of weariness and disinterest that public employees sometimes develop after years of dealing with all kinds of people. "The sheriff is at an external incident at a bar fight on the other side of town. He won't be back for 2 hours. I can register the occurrence, but without him here, I can't do anything official," said the clerk, turning his attention back to the computer. Richard felt despair tighten his chest, because 2 hours was too much time. Valerie was clearly going into panic mode and would accelerate her plans. 2 hours, but she's going to make him sign the papers by 6 o'clock today. "It will be too late," shouted Richard, hitting his hand on the desk. Michael looked at the big clock on the wall of the police station and saw the hands marking 4:30. Only 90 minutes remained. Richard made a decision at that moment, a decision that could cost everything but was the only option he saw to save Frank. "Michael, stay here with the merchant and wait for the sheriff to return. When he arrives, show him the recorder and tell him everything," said Richard, already turning to leave. Michael grabbed his grandfather's arm with both hands, his eyes wide with fear and concern. "Grandpa, no, it's dangerous. She is dangerous. What are you going to do?" asked Michael, his voice coming out squeaky. Richard knelt in front of his grandson one last time, holding the small face between his large, calloused hands, looking deeply into those eyes that were so similar to the son he had lost. "I won't let her destroy another life. I won't let another good man lose everything like I lost. Keep the recorder here with the clerk as official evidence," said Richard, and there was finally in his voice and eyes something that had been dead for 5 years, purpose and determination. Michael cried but nodded, understanding that he could not change his grandfather's decision, and Richard handed the recorder to the clerk, who formally registered it as evidence. "Come back to me, Grandpa, please come back," whispered Michael, and Richard promised he would return. Richard ran out of the police station with an energy he hadn't felt in years, his feet pounding on the pavement as he ran back toward the San Miguel Hotel. He knew the way by heart now, every street, every corner, and used shortcuts through alleys that a car couldn't traverse. His lungs burned, his heart beat erratically. His old legs protested with each step, but he kept running because there was a life at stake, and he would not fail this time. When the hotel came into view, Richard didn't slow down, running straight to the service entrance at the back that he had used the night before when Frank had taken them to the room. The door was unlocked thanks to the same administrative neglect Richard had noticed before, and he entered silently, climbing the stairs 2 at a time. On the second floor, he ran down the corridor until he reached the administrative office, and through the frosted glass of the door, he saw 2 silhouettes, Frank sitting in the chair behind the desk and Valerie standing next to him. Richard moved closer and could clearly see through a less frosted part of the glass that Frank had a pen in his hand, the tip resting on a document about to sign. Valerie was bent over him, whispering something in his ear, one hand on his shoulder possessively, and she smiled that victory smile that Richard knew too well. No, 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 thought Richard, and without hesitating another second, he burst through the door, making it slam against the wall. "Don't sign that paper," shouted Richard, and Frank and Valerie turned shocked to face him. Richard was panting in the middle of the office, his hands resting on his knees as he tried to catch his breath after having run like he had never run before, and his eyes fixed on Frank, who held the pen suspended over the documents. Valerie recovered from the initial shock faster than Frank, and her expression changed from surprise to absolute fury, her blue eyes glowing with anger as she pointed at Richard as if he were a plague that needed to be exterminated. "Security, come to the office immediately. This man has invaded the property. He's violating the restraining order. Arrest him now," shouted Valerie, her voice echoing down the hallway. Frank placed the pen on the desk slowly, his expression a mixture of confusion and something that seemed dangerously close to relief at having been interrupted at the last second. "Richard, what are you doing here? I expelled you from the hotel. You can't just invade like this," said Frank. But his voice didn't have the firmness of before. There was doubt growing in his eyes. Richard straightened up despite his lungs still burning and walked toward the desk with his hands extended in a pleading gesture. "Please, Frank, I beg you, don't sign those papers. She is a professional scammer. She will steal everything from you exactly as she did to me. Every word I said was true," said Richard, and there was genuine desperation in every syllable. Valerie quickly positioned herself between Richard and the desk, taking the documents and holding them against her chest protectively while her voice came out theatrical and alarmed. "He is completely obsessed, delusional, lost contact with reality, Frank. Just sign these papers before he does something worse, before he becomes violent," said Valerie, taking steps backward toward Frank as if Richard were a physical threat. Richard felt frustration burning in his chest because she was doing it again, manipulating the narrative, making him look like the villain when she was the one committing the crime. "I'm not violent, I never was. I just want to save this man from losing everything like I did," shouted Richard, his voice breaking with emotion. Frank was sitting in the chair completely paralyzed, his eyes moving from Richard to Valerie and back, and Richard could see the internal battle happening in that man, the struggle between what his heart said and what his eyes saw. Richard advanced, trying to reach the documents that Valerie was holding, not to hurt her, but simply to grab the papers and show Frank the hidden clauses. But Valerie backed away even faster, hiding the documents behind her back. "See, Frank, see how he's trying to attack me. Call the police now," shouted Valerie, and there was calculated hysteria in her voice. It was then that Frank rose abruptly from his chair, making it fall backward with a crash that made both Richard and Valerie freeze in place. "Stop, both of you, stop now, I can't take this anymore," shouted Frank, running his hands through his messy hair, making it even more disheveled. The silence that followed was heavy and tense, with only the sound of everyone's agitated breathing filling the small office. Frank walked to the window, turning his back on both of them, and stood there for several seconds that seemed like hours, his shoulders rising and falling with deep breaths as he tried to process everything. When he finally turned around, there were tears in the corners of his eyes and an expression of total exhaustion on his face. "Richard, I want to believe you. Part of me desperately wants to believe, but I don't have concrete reasons. You invaded my office twice, made serious accusations without solid evidence. Give me a real reason, a true reason, not to sign these papers," said Frank, and there was pleading in his voice. Richard felt that this was his last chance, perhaps the only opportunity to save that man, and the words began to pour out in a torrent of raw emotion. "Give me just 5 minutes to tell my complete story, and then you decide," said Richard, his voice trembling. Frank nodded slowly and sat on the edge of the desk, crossing his arms and waiting, while Valerie protested in the background, saying that this was a waste of time. Richard took a deep breath, feeling the weight of 5 years of pain about to be poured out, and began to speak in a firm voice despite the tears that began to fall. Her real name is Katrina Blackwell. 5 years ago, she approached me when I had a luxury hotel called Hotel Emperor, the most beautiful hotel in the city with 5 floors and 200 rooms, said Richard, and saw Frank lean slightly forward, paying attention. Richard continued describing how Valerie, or Katrina as she was called then, had approached him at a hotel industry event, how she had flirted and praised his business, how she had slowly gained his trust over months. She convinced me to form a partnership that seemed advantageous, investments that would expand the hotel, contracts that seemed legitimate. I signed papers trusting her because I was in love and blind, said Richard, his voice breaking as he remembered his own stupidity. He described how in just 3 months everything collapsed, how he discovered enormous debts in his name that he never made, how the hotel was legally transferred to other people through hidden clauses that he had signed without realizing. I lost everything, my hotel, my house, all my savings. I was literally left with nothing overnight, said Richard, wiping away the tears that now fell freely. Frank was completely still, listening to every word, and Richard could see his expression gradually changing from skepticism to something that seemed like growing horror. Richard continued his story, his voice becoming increasingly choked as he reached the most painful parts, the parts that still made him wake up screaming in the middle of the night. My son, Michael's father, couldn't bear the loss of everything we had built. The pressure and grief were too much for him, and he ended up becoming seriously ill. We lost him shortly after, said Richard, having to stop and take deep breaths several times to continue. Frank let out a choked sound of compassion, his own hand going to his mouth. My wife, my son's mother, couldn't overcome the loss. The pain was so great that her health deteriorated rapidly. The doctors did what they could, but she left us shortly after, said Richard, and now he was crying openly without shame. He described how he was left alone with Michael, who was only 4 years old, how they were evicted, how they ended up on the streets, how they spent 5 years surviving day by day without hope of improvement. Only me and a 4-year-old grandson were left on the streets, and for 5 long miserable years I carried this boy on my shoulders, trying to keep him alive and with hope, said Richard, and the emotion in his voice was so genuine that even Valerie seemed momentarily uncomfortable. Frank was crying now too, tears streaming down his face as he looked from Richard to Valerie, with an expression of growing horror. Valerie realized she was losing ground and quickly tried to regain control of the situation, throwing the documents on the table and crossing her arms defensively. It's a sad story, very sad, but that's all it is. A well-told story. Where's the concrete evidence? Where are the documents, photos, anything beyond emotional words? Said Valerie, her voice coming out harsh and cold. Richard turned to her with anger shining in his eyes, pointing with a trembling finger. The evidence was in that room, in room 237, hidden in that folder you stole from me yesterday morning. Photos of you with your other victims, documents of your other scams, everything was there, said Richard, his voice rising in volume. Valerie let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking her head as if Richard were a child talking nonsense. Falsified papers, manufactured by you to try to extort me. Anyone can see that, said Valerie, turning to Frank with a pleading expression. Frank looked from one to the other, completely lost, wanting to believe Richard, but still without concrete evidence to justify completely abandoning Valerie. I don't know who to believe. I don't know what's real and what's a lie, said Frank, burying his face in his hands. It was at that exact moment that the office door opened again and everyone turned to see who was entering, and what Richard saw made his heart leap with hope. 2 uniformed police officers entered first, followed by Michael, who ran to Richard and threw himself into his arms, followed by the grocer, and finally by a man of approximately 50 years old wearing a police chief's uniform. Excuse the interruption, gentlemen. I'm the chief from the Central Police Station. I'm looking for Mr. Frank, who is the owner of this establishment, said the chief, his voice official and firm. Frank immediately got up from the table, quickly wiping away his tears and trying to compose himself. That's me, how can I help? Said Frank, his voice coming out confused and hesitant. The chief walked to the center of the office, his eyes scanning each person present, before settling on Valerie with an expression that mixed professionalism and something that seemed like disapproval. We need to ask Miss Valerie Sanders some questions. Or would it be more appropriate to call you Katrina Blackwell? Or perhaps Christine Foster? Or maybe Amanda Warren? How many names do you use exactly? Said the chief. And Richard saw with deep satisfaction how Valerie's face instantly paled, losing all color. Frank stood completely still, processing the multiple names the chief had just mentioned, his eyes widening in shock. The chief continued speaking while taking some folded papers from his shirt pocket and opening them to read, his reading glasses sliding slightly down his nose. We received approximately an hour ago a formal complaint accompanied by evidence in recorded audio. After listening to the recording, we did a quick check in the National Criminal System and discovered very interesting information, said the chief, looking directly at Valerie over his glasses. Valerie tried to maintain her composure, but Richard could see her hands trembling slightly as she interlaced them in front of her body. You have 4 false identities registered in our system, 3 active arrest warrants in other states for fraud crimes, document forgery and racketeering, as well as 7 civil lawsuits for moral and material damages, said the chief, reading directly from the paper. Frank let out a strangled sound of shock and took several steps back, moving away from Valerie as if she were radioactive. Is this true? Is everything he's saying true, Valerie? Tell me it's not true, said Frank, his voice coming out desperate and broken. Valerie looked from Frank to the chief, and Richard saw the exact moment when she decided to abandon the charade, her expression changing completely. The mask of sweet, passionate woman fell away, revealing something cold, calculating and dangerous underneath. And when she spoke, her voice was devoid of any emotion. Frank, they have nothing concrete against me. They're just accusations based on coincidences. You know me, you trust me, said Valerie. But even she didn't seem to believe her own words anymore. It was then that Michael stepped forward, still holding his grandfather's hand, his eyes shining with determination and courage that seemed too big for such a small body. We do have evidence. We have the recording of her confessing everything on the phone at the cafe, confessing that she was stealing from Frank, that she was going to make him sign papers and then disappear with the money, said Michael, his voice childlike but firm, echoing in the silent office. One of the officers entered carrying a portable sound system, which he placed on the table, and the clerk who had come along inserted the cassette tape from the recorder they had left at the police station. This recording was officially registered as evidence an hour ago. We'll play it now, said the clerk, pressing the play button. Valerie's voice came out of the speakers clear as crystal, with no possibility of denial or alternative interpretation. I need him to sign these papers by Friday at the latest. After that, we disappear with all the money. And this idiot is left with the debts I created in his name. It's the same scheme as always, works every time, said Valerie's recorded voice, and each word was like a hammer blow to Frank's head. The silence that followed when the recording ended was so dense and heavy it seemed to suck all the air out of the office, and Richard saw Frank simply crumble. They were going to rob me, destroy me completely, do to me exactly what you did to him and how many other people, said Frank, his voice barely more than a broken whisper. Frank looked at the woman he loved, or thought he loved, and saw a complete stranger standing there in her place, someone he had never really known. Valerie didn't answer, just stood there with a blank expression, and Richard could see her eyes moving rapidly, calculating options and escape routes. Frank, we could have been so good together. You ruined everything by being too weak to sign when you should have, said Valerie, and there wasn't a trace of remorse in her voice. Suddenly, without any warning, Valerie moved, pushing the sheriff forcefully, making him stagger backward, and running toward the door in a desperate attempt to escape. The 2 officers reacted instantly, running after her, and a chase began through the corridors of Hotel San Miguel. Richard picked up Michael in his arms, protecting him, as everyone ran after Valerie and the officers, hearing her heels frantically hitting the floor as she ran. She went down the stairs, stumbling and nearly falling, regained her balance and continued running through the lobby, where guests and staff watched shocked as the scene unfolded. But the officers were younger and faster, and they caught up with her near the front door, one of them holding her arm while the other quickly put handcuffs on her wrists. Let me go, you have no right. This is abuse of authority, I'll sue all of you, shouted Valerie, struggling against the handcuffs, but it was too late. The few guests present in the lobby and the hotel staff formed a semicircle watching Valerie being handcuffed, some with shocked expressions and others with satisfaction at seeing justice being done. Valerie was dragged back through the lobby toward the exit where the police car was waiting, and when she passed by Richard and Michael, she stopped trying to turn to face them despite the officers holding her. "You'll regret this. This won't stand. I have lawyers. I have resources to reverse all of this," Valerie spat, pure venom coming from every word. Richard stood firm, holding Michael against his chest, and when he responded, his voice came out calm and full of dignity that he hadn't felt for 5 long years. "No, ma'am. The only one who will regret anything is you. You'll have plenty of time in prison to think about all the lives you destroyed, all the families you ruined, and I hope every second of that remorse hurts as much as it hurt us," said Richard, looking directly into her cold blue eyes. Valerie said nothing more, just turned her face and let herself be taken out of the hotel, and Richard watched her being placed in the back of the police car with her hands cuffed, finally captured, finally paying for her crimes. The sheriff approached Frank, who was sitting in one of the lobby armchairs, completely in shock, his face pale and his glazed eyes staring at nothing. "Mr. Frank, I need to confirm some very important information. Did you sign any final property transfer or loan documents today?" asked the sheriff, crouching in front of Frank to be at eye level. Frank blinked several times as if waking from a trance, and shook his head negatively with slow movements. "I was about to sign, the pen was in my hand touching the paper, but Richard came in and stopped me at the last possible second," said Frank, his voice coming out automatic and distant. The police chief let out a sigh of relief and put a hand on Frank's shoulder in a comforting gesture. "Then you were very lucky, luckier than most of her victims who only discover the scam after they've lost everything. We'll need all the documents she had here to add to the investigation. We'll probably discover many other crimes," said the police chief, and Frank just nodded mechanically. The police chief stood up and walked over to Richard, who was still holding Michael, extending his hand in a formal gesture. "Mr. Richard Montgomery, correct? We'll need your complete testimony about what happened 5 years ago." "You were one of her victims?" asked the police chief, shaking Richard's hand firmly. Richard nodded, feeling conflicting emotions crossing his chest. Relief that Valerie had finally been captured, mixed with the resurgent pain of reliving the trauma from 5 years ago. "Yes, I was. She completely destroyed me, took everything from me and my family," said Richard, his voice trembling slightly. The police chief nodded with a sympathetic expression and took a business card from his pocket, handing it to Richard. "With this arrest and all the evidence we're gathering, you can reopen your case criminally and also file a civil lawsuit seeking restitution for the assets you lost. I can't guarantee you'll recover everything, but at least you have a chance now," said the police chief, and these words hit Richard like lightning. The possibility of justice, of perhaps recovering something of what he had lost, was so surreal that he could barely process it. "Restitution, a chance to recover something," whispered Richard, his legs going weak. Michael hugged him tighter, that wonderful boy who had been so brave, and Richard had to sit down in an armchair before he fell. The grocery store merchant approached and placed a comforting hand on Richard's shoulder, his own eyes shining with tears of happiness. "Justice, finally. For you and for my cousin, and for everyone she hurt," said the merchant, his voice choked. Frank finally seemed to return minimally to reality and stood up from the armchair where he was sitting, walking slowly to where Richard was with Michael. Richard looked up and saw Frank standing there with tears freely streaming down his face, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs, and all the barrier of pride and distrust between them completely crumbled. "I'm sorry. Please forgive me for not believing you from the beginning. Forgive me for humiliating you and kicking you out when you were just trying to help me. Forgive me for doubting your word and trusting hers," said Frank, the words coming out rushed between sobs. Richard slowly stood up, putting Michael on the ground but keeping the boy's hand secure, and looked at Frank with genuine compassion instead of anger or resentment. "Frank, I understand perfectly. I went through the same thing you did. She is or was very good at what she did. The manipulation was perfect. I also blindly trusted her, and look what happened," said Richard, his own voice choked now. Frank shook his head as if Richard's apologies hurt him even more. "But you lost everything because of her. Your entire family was destroyed, and yet even after everything you suffered, You risked everything to save me. Why would you do that? Asked Frank, genuinely not understanding. Richard looked down at Michael, who was smiling through his own tears, that incredible boy who had taught him more about courage and kindness than he had ever taught the boy. Because my grandson reminded me that good men don't run away from doing what's right even when it hurts, even when it's difficult, even when it seems impossible. We do the right thing because it's right and not because it's easy, said Richard, stroking Michael's hair with infinite tenderness. Frank sobbed harder and stepped forward, opening his arms in a silent invitation, and Richard didn't hesitate to accept the embrace. The two men hugged each other tightly there in the lobby of the Hotel San Miguel, crying together, two survivors of the same predator, two good men who were almost destroyed, but in the end prevailed. Staff and guests watching the scene were also crying, touched by the raw display of emotion and humanity. Michael hugged both men's legs, creating a small but powerful circle of human connection. Thank you so much for saving me, for not giving up on me even when I gave up on myself," whispered Frank against Richard's shoulder, and Richard just tightened the embrace in response. Months had passed since that dramatic day at the Hotel San Miguel, and Richard was sitting in the audience of a solemn court next to Michael, both wearing simple but clean and dignified clothes that Frank had provided for them. The courtroom was full of people, many of them other victims of Valerie who had come from different cities, to witness justice finally being done, and there was a palpable tension in the air as everyone awaited the sentence. Valerie was sitting in the dock, wearing a faded orange prison uniform, her once shiny blonde hair tied in a loose ponytail, without makeup, revealing deep, dark circles and wrinkles that were once skillfully hidden. She didn't look at anyone, her eyes fixed on an indefinite point on the floor, and all that arrogance and confidence that had defined her had completely disappeared. The judge, a white-haired man with a severe expression, banged his gavel calling for silence and began to read the sentence in a loud and clear voice. Katrina Blackwell, also known as Valerie Sanders, Christine Foster, and Amanda Warren, for multiple crimes of aggravated fraud, falsification of public documents, use of false identity, and criminal association, I sentence you to 15 years in prison without the possibility of progression before serving 2/3 of the sentence, said the judge, and his voice echoed through the courtroom. Richard felt Michael squeeze his hand and the two embraced, crying tears of relief, while around them other victims did the same, finally having the closure they needed. Valerie was led away by the guards out of the courtroom, and when she passed by the audience, she looked back one last time, her eyes meeting Richard's for a fraction of a second before being forced forward. Times later, the Hotel San Miguel was completely transformed, unrecognizable when compared to the decadent establishment it had been before. The facade had been painted a soft yellow with white details, all windows replaced with new glass that sparkled in the sun, and a beautiful new sign at the entrance proclaimed in elegant golden letters, Hotel San Miguel, under new management, Frank Silver and Richard Montgomery. The interior of the hotel was equally renovated, with the lobby gleaming with freshly polished marble floors, new but elegant furniture in shades of blue and beige, and a clean crystal chandelier that cast rainbows on the walls when light hit it. Guests came and went constantly, some carrying luggage, others returning from outings, all with smiles on their faces and commenting on the exceptional quality of service. Staff wearing impeccable uniforms worked with efficiency and genuine smiles, because now they had a fair work environment and owners who treated them with respect. Richard was behind the reception desk, wearing a simple but perfectly fitted dark grey suit, white shirt and navy blue tie, his face clean and shaved, revealing features that had been hidden for years under a beggar's beard. His hair was cut and combed back, grey but dignified, and when he smiled at the guests it was the confident smile of an experienced hotelier who had returned to his natural element. "What wonderful service! I've never seen a hotel with so much attention to detail. Every employee here seems genuinely happy to serve us," said a middle-aged guest while checking out. Richard smiled that warm smile that made people feel immediately at home, and responded with the wisdom accumulated from decades in the hotel industry. "Thank you for your kind words, ma'am. True hospitality is about making people feel at home, making them feel that they matter, that they are seen and valued," said Richard, handing the final receipts to the guest. In the office that had once been the scene of so much drama, Frank and Richard were sitting side by side, reviewing papers spread across the desk, now as true partners with a legitimate contract and partnership based on mutual trust. Frank pointed to a spreadsheet with numbers that made his eyes shine with satisfaction. "Richard, look at these figures from last month. They're incredible. The hotel hasn't had results like this in years. Since before Valerie appeared in my life and started draining everything," said Frank, his voice full of pride and relief. Richard put on the reading glasses he now wore and examined the numbers with an experienced eye, nodding approvingly. "That's because you've always had a good heart, Frank. Hotels aren't just cold businesses of numbers and profits. They're about people, about creating experiences, about making a difference in the lives of guests and employees, and you never lost sight of that even when things were difficult," said Richard, removing his glasses and looking at Frank with genuine affection. Frank remained quiet for a moment, his eyes growing moist as they always did when he reconsidered how close he had been to losing everything. "I almost lost everything for believing in the wrong person, for being blind and naive," Frank said, his voice trembling. Richard placed his hand on Frank's shoulder in a comforting and fraternal gesture, squeezing slightly to convey solidarity and understanding that only someone who had been through the same could offer. "But you didn't lose, Frank. You didn't lose because when it really mattered, you chose to listen to your heart. That rainy night when you saw an old beggar and a feverish child suffering in the street and decided to open your door despite all the risks. That was the real you, the good man you've always been," said Richard, and there was deep emotion in every word. Frank turned in his chair and hugged Richard tightly, the two men who had become brothers through shared adversity, united by similar trauma, but also by redemption achieved together. They stayed like that for several seconds, until a commotion outside the office made them separate and look out the window that faced the hotel entrance. A yellow school bus had stopped in front of the hotel, and Michael was getting off it, wearing an impeccable private school uniform, navy blue pants, white shirt, blazer with the school crest embroidered on the pocket, and a new backpack. The boy walked with upright posture and dignity that seemed far beyond his 9 years, politely greeting the driver before turning toward the hotel. But the moment his eyes met Richard's through the reception glass, all that formal composure crumbled, and the boy shouted with pure joy. "Grandpa!" Michael shouted, dropping his backpack and running toward the hotel door. Richard quickly came out from behind the reception desk and crouched with open arms just in time for Michael to throw himself into them with enough force to almost knock him backward. He caught his grandson in his arms and lifted him spinning, both laughing loudly, while guests in the lobby watched the touching scene with smiles. "How was school today, my prince? What did you learn?" asked Richard, putting Michael back on the ground but keeping his hands on the small shoulders. Michael was practically jumping with excitement as he pulled crumpled papers from his blazer pocket to show his grandfather. "I got an A on my math test, Grandpa. Look here, A with a gold star. And the teacher said I have a natural talent for administration and that I should consider studying business management when I go to university," said Michael, the words tumbling out. Richard felt tears of pride fill his eyes as he examined the test with the perfect grade, and the gold star stuck at the top. "Of course you have talent. You're a Montgomery. You come from a lineage of hoteliers and businessmen. It's in your blood, my wonderful boy," said Richard, his voice breaking with emotion as he kissed the top of Michael's head. Frank watched the scene from afar, leaning against the doorframe of the office, and there was on his face a smile of genuine happiness for having been part of the transformation of those two lives. That night in the simple but comfortable apartment that Frank had given to Richard and Michael as part of the partnership, the two were in their comforting and normal nightly routine. The apartment was small, just 2 bedrooms, an integrated living room and kitchen and a bathroom, but it was clean and organized and full of details that transformed it into a home. Michael was sitting at the living room table doing homework with a blue pen, his tongue appearing at the corner of his mouth in concentration, as he always did when thinking hard. Richard was in the kitchen preparing dinner, nothing sophisticated but made with love and care, pasta with homemade tomato sauce and cooked vegetables. On the wall above the sofa were framed photos forming a gallery of memories, an old yellowed photo showing Richard's son and his wife smiling in an embrace serving as a memorial to those who had passed, A recent colored photo of Richard, Michael and Frank on the day of the hotel's reopening, all dressed formally and smiling at the camera, and a photo of Michael on his first day of school wearing the new uniform and holding a sign that said, "First Day." Michael suddenly stopped writing and stared at the photo of the parents he never really knew, his small face becoming thoughtful and a little sad. "Grandpa, do you think Dad and Grandma are watching us now, seeing everything that happened, seeing how things got better?" asked Michael, his voice sounding small and vulnerable in the way it only did when he talked about his deceased parents. Richard immediately dropped the spoon he was using to stir the sauce and walked to the table, sitting next to his grandson and pulling the chair close. "I am absolutely certain, my child, completely certain, without any doubt that they are seeing everything," said Richard, putting his arm around Michael's small shoulders. The boy turned to look at his grandfather, with those big dark eyes full of need for confirmation and comfort. "Do you think they're proud of us, proud of me? Does Dad think I'm a good boy?" asked Michael, and the raw vulnerability in that question broke Richard's heart. He hugged his grandson tightly, rocking slightly from side to side as he used to do when Michael was younger and needed to be calmed down. "Proud, Michael. Your father and grandmother are radiant from wherever they are. Just look at you. A strong, brave, intelligent boy. You saved not only me, but Frank too. You were the hero of this whole story," said Richard, his voice choked with emotion. Michael vigorously shook his head against his grandfather's chest, disagreeing. "No, Grandpa, you were the hero. You could have run away when we found those documents, but you stayed. You could have given up on me all those years on the streets, but you didn't. You taught me everything about being a real man, about honor and kindness, and doing the right thing even when it's difficult," said Michael. And now he was crying too. The two stayed there embracing, crying together, tears of healing, of closing a painful chapter, of beginning something new and better, and the dinner on the stove was forgotten for a few minutes, while grandfather and grandson allowed themselves this moment of shared vulnerability. A week later, the Hotel San Miguel was beautifully illuminated at night, each window shining with warm and welcoming light, and in the inner garden that had been transformed into an elegant space with plants, fairy lights hanging, and decorated tables, a small celebration was taking place. It was the one-year anniversary of the partnership between Frank and Richard, and employees, special guests, and even the grocer, who was now the official supplier of fruits and vegetables for the hotel, were present celebrating. Frank was standing holding a champagne flute and lightly tapped it with a spoon, asking for everyone's attention. "A year ago, I almost lost everything. Not just my hotel, but my dignity, my sanity, my future. A woman I blindly trusted almost completely destroyed me. But on that rainy night, two angels disguised as beggars knocked on my door and saved me without even knowing," said Frank, his voice trembling as he looked at Richard and Michael. He continued talking about how Richard had taught him that true hospitality begins with compassion, how Michael had shown him that courage has no age, how together they had taught him that family isn't just blood, but who stands by your side when everything falls apart. Richard stood up emotionally and made his own toast. "Frank, you gave me back something I thought I had lost forever. My dignity as a man and as a professional. You gave me a second chance when the whole world saw me as just an invisible beggar, and more importantly, you gave a real future to my grandson," said Richard, raising his glass. Michael jumped from his chair and raised his orange juice glass high above his head, making everyone laugh with the adorable seriousness on his small face. "I want to make a toast too to Grandpa, who is the bravest man in the whole world, to Uncle Frank, who is the kindest man I know, and to good people who always win in the end, even when it seems impossible," said Michael, and everyone toasted with tears in their eyes. The party continued with soft music, lively conversations and laughter, and in a quiet corner of the garden, Richard and Frank talked while watching Michael play with other children of some employees. "You know, Richard, that morning when I saw you with Michael in the office surrounded by papers, I was completely paralyzed. I thought you were doing something bad, planning to rob me. But in reality, you were saving me," said Frank, shaking his head at the irony. Richard smiled, looking at the stars that were beginning to appear in the night sky. "Life has these strange ironies. Sometimes what seems like a threat is actually a blessing in disguise," said Richard. Frank turned to him and placed his hand on his shoulder. "Thank you for not giving up on me even when I threw you out and humiliated you," said Frank. Richard placed his own hand over Frank's. "Thank you for that rainy night when you opened your door to two strangers who desperately needed kindness," said Richard. They hugged once more as Michael ran to them and embraced both around the waist, creating a perfect circle, a family formed not by blood, but by kindness, courage, and redemption. And above them in the sky, two stars shone brighter, as if they were Richard's son and his wife finally at peace, seeing that everything turned out well. Did you enjoy Michael and Richard's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on the screen. Click there and I'll be waiting for you.